Hello, everyone. Yeah, I know that you've been able to hear us for a short while. We were trying to overcome one of the British stereotypes of being awkward and being all cool and relaxed. So James and I have known each other for a while. James is the founder and creative director of a fantastic company based not only in London, but in Los Angeles and in Germany. And his company is called Koto. Is it the correct name, Koto, or Koto Studio, James? Am I getting it right?
It's just Koto. Yeah, just Koto. The studio is just there for the URL.
Good to know. So Koto describes themselves as making brands come alive. Any brand can look good, but in today's crowded market, only those that can make and keep a real connection with customers will truly thrive. Koto was founded on the belief that good design and powerful ideas can create a lasting emotional experience between a brand and its audiences. And yes, I was reading that out because I wanted to get it right. Koto are an amazing company. They have a fantastic range of clients, from a small shoe manufacturer you may have heard of called Nike, to a taxi busting service called Uber, and a travel destroying app called Airbnb, and I mean that in the nicest sense. James, why don't you do a little brief intro on yourself?
Thanks, Duncan. I think you've done a really good job, so I'm not sure what's left to say. But yeah, so there's 50 of us, sit globally, writers, strategists, designers, motion, animation, client services team, and all of us are working in teams that we build when we work with people like Duncan, to look at companies' brands and help them turn up in the world in what we describe as the new era of attention. And this idea that any of us in any day, whether online or offline, are exposed to thousands and thousands of brands and images, whether that's kind of doing our grocery shopping or whether that's just watching TV and doing some second screening on our devices. And so the brands that we work with need to understand the ecosystem with which they exist, the world with which they exist. And so, yeah, that's our kind of fundamental day-to-day existence. Obviously, a lot of us working from home at the moment.
Thank you, James. And by way of introduction myself, I'm Duncan Bird. I am the VP of Brand and Digital here at Fiverr. Welcome, everyone, to Fiverr's Shift, our first conference in this new virtual digital world. Thank you all for joining us. Despite my appearances, I'm not a guitar player. It's just a hobby that I have in the background. So the point of this session is just to really tap into some of James's phenomenal experience and expertise around design in terms of forward-thinking aspects of design. Let's kick off then, James, with in your view, what does it mean to be forward-thinking when it comes to design, and how does Koto embody that idea?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think designers naturally, I've found, a kind of a forward-looking future in their thinking, just because they're optimistic about the world, and so therefore it's always about kind of using design, hopefully to make things better. Whether that's helping a company that's launching, helping a company that needs design to help it revitalize, whether that's getting something through that's not being communicated in the past. And so I think for us, what it means as well is understanding the world with which we exist. So how it relates to Koto is, a lot of people will come to us and they'll have a design challenge and they'll be like, right now I need to get this sorted out. Whether that's starting a new business, we work with a lot of companies in the tech space. They've got some funding, they want to get out there, they want to get an identity, they want a website, whatever they need. And the thing that we have to work with a lot on those companies is say, yeah, you are branding now, but we're also branding you in the future, because consistency is key. And if you're going to go out there and spend a lot of effort and time to get customers or users, or however you describe the people that engage with your brand, then you want them to be with you for a good amount of time. And so to do that, you need to make the brand that feels relevant for 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, ideally 10 years' time, as much as it does today. For the emotional reason of creating something that exists and lasts, and so people can kind of create a connection with it, whether that's your local coffee shop or whether that's a big global business. But in the other practical thing is that from a client perspective, I don't want my clients to come back to me and say, that brand you charged me all that money for a year ago is out of date and doesn't work anymore. And so, we need to think about the way that people are investing time and money in spending time with us in the teams that we've got. And so there is a certain amount of future forecasting that we have to do, and if I look at a company like Airbnb that you mentioned earlier, so I led the Airbnb rebrand back in 2013, and 7 years later, it's still fundamentally in place as where it is as the work we did there, because we spent a lot of time thinking, what's happening with this company? What's the potential it's got? How can we make a brand that can last these kind of changing times? And, I'm hopeful that that's gonna stay for another 3 years at least to see its decade through, and I'm sure it will last a lot longer beyond that. But yeah, so for me, I think forward thinking and about design is about looking into that future, and no one can predict the future, but we can have a good sense of what design can do to help us through what can be sometimes an interesting process.
Right. How would you advise businesses to think about how they go about prioritizing brand and design across a company? And it's such a broad question, but let's say for a more of a medium to large size company, because I think we can touch on smaller ones too, but I think the challenges are slightly different.
Yeah, I think every company comes to design and brand at a different moment in time. I think it depends whether they're a company that makes a digital product, a physical product, whether they're having customer interaction in the real world, whether the only time they ever see their customers is in the digital world. I think, more and more design is a great differentiator. I think a lot of people are launching products that are in some way similar to something else. There's not that many unique ideas left in the world, if any at all, arguably. And so in doing that, I think design early on in that situation will help companies stand out and differentiate themselves across their competitor set. We always talk at Koto about understanding something that's true about the company, not using design to pretend you are something you're not, making sure you're credible so that you exist in the market in a space where it feels like people are going to trust you, but then also trying to strive to find some uniqueness, something that makes you stand out, a visual DNA, a verbal DNA, something that's going to have that difference. And so for me, I think it's about looking at the journey, where you think you're going to engage with customers, how they exist within that space. I think that's the kind of thing that for me is about understanding where design should be engaged with in the process. But yeah, ideally for most people, as early as you can possibly afford. Though design can be perceived to be a luxury or expensive or something I don't think at first, and so that's a real challenge to sometimes see the value of it when there's a million things that businesses.
Why do you think so many businesses struggle with that? Because I agree with you that I think in my time in my career that you can divide the businesses into one of two groups: those that are design centric and those that just don't see it as a core necessity. What do you think drives that?
It's an interesting one. I think we have a relationship with design that is formed by quite often our education, our adolescence, and so our exposure to technology. I think the explosion of desktop publishing in the 1990s made people see design in their own computers that they had at home or they worked with, and so therefore maybe the value of it wasn't perceived in the same way. I think if I kind of jump to an adjacency, I think a lot of people when they first start their own companies or get out in the world will do their own writing. They'll write their own press release or they'll write their own website or that, and at some point it will dawn on them that actually they could probably make this writing cut through a little bit, but because they have a relationship with writing, they kind of maybe at first don't realize that a professional would really kick it on to that next level. And I think design has a similar problem. I also think as well there's maybe a perception that design is quite quick and you can kind of knock it out on the computer, and actually there's actually to really be able to stand out and really find that kind of uniqueness, it takes a lot of time and exploration. And one of the things that we find again and again is that people maybe perceive us to be expensive, but people have to pay people's wages. We have to look after them in the way that we should as a responsible employer. And so I don't think people necessarily connect the dots between the thing that they need, which is maybe perceived to be a small bit of the business, versus the human cost of what it costs to get that thing to be great, and then to put it out in the world.
So let's just talk a little bit about the title of this conference, the shift. What sort of shifts has your company had to make? We've been working together and having to do it remotely. how's it changed the way you work with both your people in your company and your existing clients? And even I'd find it fascinating to know how you go about things like new business in a climate like this.
So I think the kind of obviously a few tiers of questions in there. I think one of the things which I think is maybe underestimated in the world of remote working is communication is more of a challenge. And I think people say, well, we've got platforms, we've got Zoom, we've got all these ways of getting around it. And yeah, that's right. There are solutions out there. But I think what we really need to bear in mind is that so much of communication is, especially when you're meeting people, is about the kind of the way the conversation flows between people, the cues that we naturally give each other when we're communicating, the fact that we'll get kind of reassurance. And if you put kind of distance and screens, and in between people, then you will start to lose that connection. So that is definitely a challenge. I think in terms of internally kind of making sure the team, for the purposes of everyone watching right now, there's 50 people that work at Koto. They sit in 3 studios normally, whereas at the moment, obviously, everyone apart from our Berlin office is sat at home. And so the challenge there is that we're having to rely upon the written communication a bit more, and that's way more open to misinterpretation. And I think that's a challenge that everyone has felt probably even before COVID times, in terms of the email to a client that maybe was misworded, or there's lots of historical anecdotes about people that didn't do that. There's a George Bernard Shaw quote which goes, "The biggest misconception about communication is the fact that it is in fact taken place in the first place." And I think that's really, really true, is that people think that they're communicating, but they're not necessarily. And so I think that's the big challenge about working from home. In terms of the new business for us as a company, the biggest challenge is building that rapport with people. I think Duncan, for everyone watching, Duncan and I have worked together for quite a few months now, and that working relationship requires trust, because we're exploring things collaboratively together between the two teams. And so to do that trust, it would normally be built up in in-person sessions. And so you have to kind of use the things that you have around you to be able to help build that trust and that understanding and that kind of single mind space that we need when working on creative projects.
So do you feel, and I'm not talking about us because you're obviously going to say yes, but do you feel across the board that you're having to work harder for your clients?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some basic stuff like you can do problem solving in person a lot easier. So if there's loads of you in the room, there's a whiteboard, or there's lots of, you can work through stuff, and you can hear everyone's opinion. It's much easier. What are the things that happen on that kind of front. I think in terms of the working with the team, you have to do a lot more kind of one-on-one catch-ups, because you have to make sure that people are okay. I think it's an incredibly stressful time at the moment, and so therefore have to look after people emotionally, have to make sure that they're in a good space to be creative, because creativity requires a lot of energy. We have to kind of over-communicate with the people that we're potentially working with to make sure that there's not misunderstandings, and that we're kind of agreeing a process that's going to make sense for them. So there's a lot of effort, and and there's a lot of written on the internet about Zoom fatigue and a kind of unnatural feeling of talking with a floating version of yourself in front of you. And I think all of that kind of adds to this overall level of what's challenging time for anybody right now. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, we on the last panel that I moderated, we talked about that a lot. And the guys, for anyone who wasn't on that session, they were both all of the panelists were saying the challenge in creativity is twofold. One, looking after mental health, so you don't kind of go around the bend. And then the other part of creativity, particularly in design, comes from very weird, odd places, not from staring like this. It could be going on a walk, could be being at a concert, a museum, or anything. Anyway, let's make a shift, boom, boom, to the evolution of branding. So a lot of large brands have undergone large rebrand efforts in recent years, and many have moved towards a flatter, kind of cleaner design aesthetic. I'm sure you saw that meme that went around with there was a lot of kind of luxury brand logos before and after, and it just, they all look the same. Do you think eventually this is going to go out of style, and how do you maintain brand equity when you begin changing large elements of your brand identity? So like positioning, logo, mission, etc. This is like a question for an entire conference, but go for it, James. You're a genius.
So flat design aesthetic, I think that, there's some technologically historic reasons for that, which is, the fashion example you mentioned is about the need to merchandise brands, the brands, that need to appear on clothing, the need for a certain adaptability in that. So someone like Burberry, their logo didn't used to need to look really good above a door of a store in a very particular bit of London or where else they place themselves in the world, on a bag, on a nice little thing that your receipt came in, and that was about it really. And in those places you were looking at the kind of historical connotations, the semiotics of where that exists. Fast forward to 2019, 2020, the Burberry logo predominantly needs to look amazing on products, so whether that's on sneakers, sweatshirts, whatever that they're kind of diversifying across their brand at this moment in time. They've gone from being a brand where their kind of icon was the Macintosh through to a brand that ultimately expresses itself probably more in streetwear. And so that's about surfaces, that's about platforms, that's about kind of diversification. The kind of flat design.
Doesn't that in that example though with Burberry, doesn't that take away from the specialness of what Burberry stood for before they went down that path?
Yeah, you could argue it does, but I think you could also argue that equity already exists, and so therefore you're not going to be, by changing the logo, ruining that equity, because that kind of is, they're already acknowledged as one of the great houses. In the same way that the kind of simplification of the French fashion houses, it shows the move away from the atelier into much more kind of ready to wear, super high turnover of stuff, particularly with diversification of sales across the globe rather than it being bought in a few key European and American cities. It's like, being bought everywhere, e-commerce, etc. In terms of the flat design of kind of like the rest of the world, I think, it comes from a digital first space. It comes from the fact that this is where we look at our brands, these little small pixel squares, the fact that we have a flexibility need, which has never been bigger. It needs to appear brilliantly in all those spaces. And also as well, we've gone through the revolution of the app store. The numbers of apps that people download is kind of falling massively. People are much less kind of like browsy in their behavior. They go to download an app for a reason, and then it's got a little bit of time on their phone, and then if it doesn't last, it comes off. And there's this stat that came out recently, which is 16% of millennials in the US have moved the phone function from their iPhone front page to a later page. And so they're very much living on these devices in an app world. And so within that, it's about that kind of standout, that frequency of use. I want you to use X over Y. And so in that, it's also moving away from the more skeuomorphic kind of Apple thing. Now, Apple have put a bit more depth back in their iconography recently. Brands are finding a bit more depth. But I think what we'll find happen is I think we're on the edge of a precipice of where everything's going to move. Screen prices have fallen to an all-time low. The cost of a television now compared to 20 years ago has never been cheaper. And I think the thinner screens get, the more applied that the screens get, the more that we will see them in our transport hubs, in our grocery stores, everywhere. And so in that, I think we're going to have to bring a certain depth back to our brands, because you can't have everything flat when it's in a motion world. So I think there's going to be an interesting revolution and challenge on that front.
So it seems to me one of my favourite brands, Mr. Paul Smith, probably coming up backwards, he was somehow ahead of his time in a way, because by just using his signature and some stripy colours and merchandising the hell out of it, inside jackets and on shoes and pencils, he hasn't changed that branding at all. No,
and but I also think the thing about Paul Smith is that he is synonymous with the brand, and so therefore they don't really need a brand book of sorts. They don't really need that kind of central core. It's, when Steve Jobs was still around at Apple, they didn't need some of the brand apparatus that some brands needed, because he was so the kind of fulcrum of everything that was right or wrong. And as this kind of like, he's probably, in the same way that Paul Smith is like a creative director of everything, and I think even Brian, who I've worked with at Airbnb, he is creative director in chief. And so therefore there is this kind of sense of whether something's intrinsically or right or wrong goes through kind of one person's lens of how they see the brand as a whole. Whereas I think things, brands like Dior or Burberry have had many different creative directors over time, and so therefore have much more of a kind of changing pattern of behavior. And so I think there's an interesting challenge on that front in terms of like, what is a brand's source of power? Where does it come from? And then how does that come out in the world in a design language?
Right. Okay. Um, in terms of the approach to design and managing design projects, do you think this is going to change post-COVID? I mean, it's $1 million question because we don't know what post-COVID looks like, but I was thinking we were coming out of this, but we seem now to be accepting that we're in this for perhaps a lot longer than any of us would choose. Do you think it's going to make changes to how we think and work?
Yeah, I do think so, actually. I think what will happen is, I think that, and you guys are super well placed for this, I think what will happen is that people will realize, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, that, it's going to accelerate the ability to be able to do things online. I think, the hiring of professional services for people, I think people would still predominantly look to their existing networks and try and find someone that had previously used someone or whatever. Whereas I actually think, kind of like showing us that we can live so much more of our lives online, and I think there's going to be an interesting side effect of things like Zoom being used for family catch-ups. It's going to expose people to the power of, we've had FaceTime on our phones for a long time, but people haven't necessarily used it quite to the amount they could do. I think we're going to see things like Facebook Portal, more kind of permanent hardware solutions that people have in their lives to connect with people. And so I think that will come into our professional lives. And so we won't necessarily be tied to this kind of geographical idea of, I need to work with someone, they need to be where I am. And I actually, in a way, we're going to see a bit of a turbocharged globalization. And I think a company like Fiverr is in a good place to be able to really open up that democracy of being able to connect with people, be able to deliver services wherever you are in the world. And so I think there's a great meritocracy to it. I think for some people it might be complicated to navigate, but I think there's an exposure thing to technology which is happening right now, which I think will have to have an effect. Will the world all work remotely after all this? No, I don't think they will. I think people will still, after it's kind of all said and done, move back to social centres, because for a lot of people the energy they get is by being in the room with other people. So
I think one of the interesting things listening to you is the aspect of seeing on screens and doing as we're doing now. As I speak, I see myself, which is super weird. Someone was saying on the other panel, I thought was a fascinating insight from the CEO of Dribble, I think, that one of the things he really tries to do every day at some point is get off Zoom and take a regular phone call outside and walk around. And it sounds ridiculous that could be such a big thing. Between the two sessions, we had a call with the production company, and it was on the phone, and everyone on the call went, "Isn't this great not being able to see each other?" Yeah. So there's some kind of slight reverse psychology of the more we see each other on screens, the more you kind of want to go back to more analog. And on that call, it was so much harder to work out who was talking, because we've got like this idiot guide. Everybody who's watching us knows I'm Duncan and you're James. And if you take that picture away, do you think that we'll reach a point where, if this just keeps dragging on, that actually seeing people could be less helpful?
Yeah, I think maybe. I think we'll probably see, video conferencing has been around for a long old while, and it's been very much a niche part of most people's communication. For some people more than other people less. I think this will really put it in the spotlight, and we'll understand what its flaws are. Similarly, in the way that when social media first came out, it was only seen in a positive light. And it's not until it's been through the ringer of the last kind of 3 years, maybe a little bit longer now, that we've really started to understand the flaws of it as well as the kind of pros of it. And I think that's a natural technological kind of evolution. It's like when cinema first came out at the turn of the century before last, people thought it was going to corrupt the youth and it was going to destroy them. Now it didn't. It didn't lead to kind of laziness in labour and all the things that people thought was going to happen. But it did bring some challenges with it, and so that's any technological evolution. And so I think right now we will flush through it and see some interesting things the other side.
Yeah, you put me in mind of an article I read in Wired magazine, I want to say probably 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a very thought-provoking editorial piece on the idea that in the future, will we look at the evolution of smartphones as our generation's cigarettes, in that we let kids have them and yada yada. I mean, as I look at myself, I've now got blue light filter glasses because I can feel it damaging my eyes, the amount of time I'm spending staring at these bright white screens. I mean, that's just, it's such a kind of a mind-numbingly big topic. So let's bring it back to design. What brands do you see as revolutionary and innovative in terms of their design, and why?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. I read this one and I thought, well, there's a myriad of ways that you can go through this. I think, you know, you can look at design through many different lenses. There's the kind of aesthetic, aspirational component, the thing that like looks lovely and feels great. There's the kind of useful, enriching version of like things you can look at, the user experience, something that stays with you. I think, you know, if I look at both things put back together, I think one thing that this time has really proved and really been very strong at is that it's shown that if brands get home workouts right, they're going to really kind of open up this whole new world. So the brand that I picked when you posed this question to me in the email beforehand is Peloton. And what I'm going to say is just a caveat for everyone that's watching is Peloton is one of my clients, though we didn't do the logo. And for me, what I think is interesting about it is that it shows that an exercise bike, which is something that has existed for many, many years, you know, many people have relationship with an exercise bike has probably been going to the gym, going on it for a period of time, getting a bit sweaty, getting off, and then going on and getting on with the next piece of equipment. Maybe not going to the gym as much as they'd like to. All of the barriers that lay in the way, whether that's geographic proximity, whether the gym's busy, whether you can't get on the equipment, all these things. You take that, you put it at home, you put a screen on front of it, and you realize that actually the biggest barrier to entry with exercise is motivation. And once you deal with that motivation, once you realize that actually that's what's stopping me going and exercising every day is, can I be bothered? Have I had a hard day at work? I've got my kids I've got to look after. Whatever my reason for it is, if I can get past that barrier of motivation, then I can really start to realize that this can be a fundamentally positive experience in my life. I can connect with the community. I can feel belonging. There's a variation of classes available. The thing itself, ergonomically beautifully designed. The UI is really, really good to use. Yes, it's exclusive in the fact that if you get the bike, it's, you know, $2,000, which is a lot of money and shouldn't be looked over. But they've made a product that works on an iPhone, which a lot of people, or smartphone, which a lot of people have at home, easy to use. For $12 a month, you've got these amazing classes that they've got in there. And so for me, I think it's a brand.
Do you have one?
What's that?
Do you have one?
Yeah, I've got a Peloton. Yeah. And
correct answer.
But for me, what's amazing about it is it's shown that they've thought about the role of design in each of the things. So how do I copy a class at home? Where do I think about it? You know, where I should focus on whether things look good, how I should focus on the communication around it, how I should understand it, you know. And so for me, I think that's a piece of product. You're going to see loads of copies. Mirror that's just been bought by Lululemon is another kind of home exercise piece of equipment. I think that's going to definitely be one of the things we're going to see come out this time, which is we're going to disconnect ourselves from gyms, which were never particularly pleasurable experiences for a lot of the population. And I think we're going to see a massive explosion of home exercise delivered by, you know, apps in our pockets, which had already been happening pre-COVID, but it's just going to turbocharge it. So for me, a good, innovative brand that's really put design at the core of what it's done.
Cool. Nice. I'd never really thought about Peloton like that until you explained it. And yeah, the home gym thing is fascinating. As I look out to my left, my next door neighbours have built a gym in their garden, and I'm kind of jealous. And they have a gym instructor who comes over, I'm guessing was their gym instructor. So that's another creative way around it. We said we're going to do questions at the end, but there's a really interesting one popped up here from Aidan Fleetwood. Thank you, Aidan. When we were just talking about the conferencing thing, he asked, what can we learn from Skype's apparent failure to step up to the plate and offer the most accepted conference calling platform? He's saying, was there a design failure? And I've actually thought that myself, because Skype has been around. It's been on phones, even pre-smartphones. How come nobody talks about Skype anymore?
So it's a really interesting question. That I think there's a number of reasons, as far as I'm concerned, for Skype's failure to capitalize in this period of time. So the thing that's out of control of anyone that's ever worked at Skype is the business has been sold a number of times. So it went from being an independent business, it's been sold 2 other times, I think, and in each of those cases, what's happened is it's lost its impetus to innovate. A lot of companies really struggle to continue innovation once they kind of get to market. And so what happened was that I think Skype had a product which was definitely set up to win, and there's loads of business books out there that tell you you never want to be the first, you want to be the second, because you'll learn all the first mistakes. I think what Skype did is kind of is they're a victim of circumstance. I think the second thing that's crazy is at some point it became a verb. I'd Skype you, and so you knew that was meant, and it was a video call, and the same way that I said I'll Uber over there, or and that's the holy grail for brands. That's where you want to be. You want to be a verb that's used in that way, but in the same way that for many years Hoover, vacuum cleaning, that kind of
Hoover.
similar. I'm going to do the hoovering. What an amazing bit of like brand evidence piece that is. But what happened was, so they failed on the innovation, been sold by a number of companies, got lost in the absolute myriad of Microsoft's brands. The only brand that stands out in the Microsoft kind of ecosystem beyond Windows is Xbox, and that's because Xbox has always had a certain DNA and a bit of difference to it. And so they got lost as part of a bigger thing. And in that, what happened was, because it was no longer prioritized, it no longer had that ability to be as great as it could do. And I think one of the things that Zoom has very cleverly realized is that as soon as a video call cuts, fails, drops out, has software issues or whatever, it is literally one of the most frustrating things in the world, because you're blocking communication. It's like someone running into a meeting room and saying stop, and like stopping you from talking. There's a similar kind of like jarringness to it. And so Zoom just from the off spent a lot of effort and a lot of time making sure that connection was strong. You're holding all these things. And so yes, to answer Aidan's question, there's a big design failure in there, which is do one thing well. If you're going to start any company, if you're going to start any brand, if you're going to work with any brand, it's one of the best bits of advice is do one thing well, and then add all that other stuff afterwards that brands need to. But carry on doing that one thing well, and you have that North Star, then you will continue to have success. But as soon as you diversify too much, start doing loads of different things, take your eye off the ball, lose the focus, fail to continue innovating around what made you successful in the first place, then you will see other people come into play and they will take over.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, I think that's very, very well put. I knew the Microsoft part of it. I'd forgotten that they'd been bought several times over, which I think you're absolutely right. It's almost like a creative baton getting dropped in some kind of relay race. And having worked, I don't know if you ever have, I worked at one agency where we merged or we were bought, or I can't remember exactly what the technical thing is, but when you try and bring those two creative cultures together, and similarly at Sony Music where I work, where we merged with BMG, there's always like a culture clash, and however much people try and say there won't be, there just is. It's challenging. So what is one key emerging trend or prediction you have for design in the next year or two?
Oof. It's a really tough one, that one, because I think you can approach that from like a myriad of different ways. I think one emerging trend is I think that we might be coming to the end of the illustrated people that every software and tech brand had everywhere, which showed this kind of utopian idea of people working together. I think it became successful because it's very easy to deploy and you can stick it across all your channels with ease and it works really well. But I think it's not going to help brands stand out. And so I think illustration will still have a place in a lot of brands out there because it does a great thing. But I don't think it will be the primary image driver, because I think we will look to want to see real people behind the products that we engage with. I think, there's been a growing trend for authenticity that's been continuing. And I think with the political landscape as it is globally at the moment, I think authenticity will be craved more than ever. And so I think we're going to see that need for authenticity coming through in the brands and the way that comes to life. And so in that, I think we'll probably see a little bit less of the faceless time that we've had recently. I think, companies like Facebook have failed to invest in their brand for many years. And so as soon as they came under scrutiny or fire, they had nothing to kind of like rest on. I think someone asked a question earlier in the feed that caught my eye, which is how can you build trust as a brand? And for me, trust is repeated interactions. That is the definition of trust for me. Is I meet a new friend, the more time I spend with them, the greater trust I have. I've had my bank account since I was 13 with a company, with a bank. I trust them because they've always been there. It's completely like, there's the kind of like mainstay of it. you can fast forward that trust by making sure that you communicate clearly, well, consistently with people. And so I think companies, brands, whatever scale, whatever size they are, need to aspire to that repeated interaction. Try and connect that connection with people.
I'd love to get you to talk a little bit, if you can, because I know how challenging it is with the kind of client agency confidentiality, as anyone who was early on this session will have heard me talking about when I didn't realize that we were live. I'd love to hear a little bit about Airbnb, because I'm a heavy Airbnb user. I started out very skeptical about it, didn't think it was for me, it was for other types of people. I thought it was a price proposition for people who perhaps couldn't afford a certain type of travel. And then something happened, depending on who you listen to. It's all about design or not about design, and it's about this and it's about that and about the other. But I'd love to hear just a little bit about that evolution, particularly in the word of trust, because I think staying in a stranger's house requires a hell of a lot more trust than going into one of Mr. Hilton's hotels. Let's talk about trust and Airbnb, particularly in relation to design, because I think it's such a complicated story, the Airbnb story. But I think from design, my personal take, and I don't know at what point you got involved, is their early designs reinforced the idea to me that it was kind of a student type website. Apologies to any students listening. I was one once too. And then I don't know how or why I overcame that. Maybe it was word of mouth. Maybe it was fantastic advertising that Jonathan Mildenhall did, or you tell me.
So I think Airbnb, for me personally, and obviously there's a collective truth in every group of people that ever work on something, which is there's your truth, my truth, and the truth in the middle, and they're all true, and they're all the way that we see the lens of things. But for me, it's a story of some monumental changes, decisions, but it's also a story of marginal gains. So the monumental decisions are understanding at some point that their biggest flaw was that they needed to take better photos of the listings, because if I can see where I'm staying, then I have greater trust, and so therefore I'm more implied to booking. So they completely over-engineered, this was before I was involved, they completely over-engineered the photography, where they started, and so Brian and Joe, two of the founders of Airbnb, there's a famous story, they went to New York and they started photographing themselves with some great camera kit that they'd hired, all of the listings that were available in New York. And what they found was instantly booking rates went up, trust rate went up, host satisfaction went up, and all it was as simple as saying, this is where you're going to stay, this is what it looks like, no nasty surprises when you turn up.
Which, as you say that, I mean, it sounds so obvious, right?
But yeah, but back then, the people that were their competitors, the more traditional like lettings of kind of holiday homes, etc. They most of them had some photos that had been taken at some point in time. They weren't necessarily thinking about them, and what they've done is through kind of user research, realised these are the things I'm looking for. I want to know where I'm going to sleep. Cleanliness.
And presumably at this point, Airbnb was fairly small.
Yeah, so it's kind of like I can't give you the head count or scale or anything because it's been such an exponential curve. It's hard to remember, when I first worked with Airbnb, they would still do, the San Francisco office would still do a happy hour where, everyone would go to one bar, and now there's, I think, 5,500 people work at the San Francisco campus. Those days are long gone. In terms of like the other monumentals on top of that is about then understanding that actually if you do a price-based offer, then you're completely open to everyone else, because anyone can offer a price-based offer and you can just be undercut by the next person. And so as design graduates, the two founders, Brian and Joe, realized that they needed to better invest in design because that would be the differentiating factor. So show the kind of the more strategic side of the brand, the more kind of visionary component of what they were looking for, where that came from, based upon a really interesting insight, which was lots of people came for the price and stayed for the experience. They went, I'll go there, it's cheap, I'll save some money on that trip. I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. And then realized that actually they stayed with a host. It was much nicer to stay in a home because you had amenities. Quite often stay in a Hilton hotel, you'll be in the hotel district of a lot of cities, which isn't necessarily the best place to go out to eat or the best place to meet friends for drinks or the best place to, be able to kind of see the best of a city. So you're missing out on the whole component of living like a local. And then the kind of the other bits around that are all about, how they've marketed, the fact that they've acknowledged the fact that they have kind of gone up market, the fact that they've acknowledged there's been some breakpoints. So having done the original rebrand, I also oversaw the invention of the Plus brand, which is a kind of more premium tier, and then the luxury tier, and understanding that actually by merchandising and splitting out the product offer into tiers, which is something that hotel companies have done for obviously many years. A company like Hilton has, I think last time, about 27 brands in its kind of ecosystem, is that you start to have this kind of central idea of what people believe for in a brand, but then you have this ability to position them in the right place that they want to go, whether that's based around comfort, whether that's based around location, whether that's based around price, whatever people's looking for. And as brand scales, you need to be able to adapt more use cases. And so, yeah, for me, it's that kind of the big landmark moments, the story, like, them going out their way to go and do the photography, but it's also those marginal gains, understanding where you're pushing customers to, how they interact with it. They've done so much work on their app, and they continue to do so much work on their app. And in each time, they're always tweaking, changing very small details, but delivering a better customer experience each time. And so for me, it's, it's never done. And that's the thing. I think a lot of companies make that mistake. They get to a point and they go, right, that's done. I'll put that over there. I'm going to go and work on this instead. Whereas for Airbnb, it's constantly iterating, changing, because that's how they stay ahead of the competition and understand what they need to do.
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight, that the work is never done. And I think when I think back to one of the earlier questions about the brands that really invest in design versus brands that see it as like either an afterthought or a waste, I think that's one of the things that those brands that are more design centric benefit from, because you're always thinking about it rather than playing catch up. Another question here I had was, with the shift to digital versus in person, is there a new way to go about creating brand designs and the way brands interact with digitally only consumers, do you think?
I think you have to be much more aware of the existence of where it's going to end up. Otherwise, what happens is the brand will disappear when it gets to a product level, because it won't be able to facilitate itself in the product environment. And so what that means is you need to understand that there's also a point where brand needs to get out of the way. If I'm using a complex, so I've done some work with Skyscanner, which has a lot of complex flight data at times. And so in that situation, you don't want lots of brand in the way. You want to be able to compare all of the flights that are available to you at that moment in time. And so what we've done with each of the brands that we've worked with in the digital space is like, where is brand important? Where does it need to be present versus where does it need to get out of the way? What do you need fundamentally as an experience that should be branded? If I think about something like Skyscanner, a lot of people will browser tabs shop, and so they'll have like 4 tabs open. They'll be looking for the best flight price. They'll be convinced that there's some kind of super deal out there and I'm going to be the person to find it. And so in doing that, they're kind of jumping backwards and forwards. You want to make the product experience, which is the sticky one, which they go, right, I've looked everywhere. The cheapest I could get that flight was for $89. You want them to come back to you and be booking with you. And you do that with a great experience, great after customer care, booking app, delivery of boarding passes, all of the things that people are looking for in that experience. And so brand is definitely a part of all those things, but it's just about understanding that customer journey and where it should be and where it should get out of the way.
Great, fascinating. How does good design, in your experience, James, impact the world for the better?
Well, not all design impacts the world for the better, and a lot of design can definitely get in the way of it. But I think a guy I used to work for many years ago once, I wouldn't once say to me, said it to me many times, had this kind of mantra, which was everybody deserves good design. And I think for me, we're not there yet, but we are seeing design impacting people globally in a very successful way. And so, that can be things like, for a few years ago now, worked on creation of a social network for farmers in Africa called We Farm, and that was about using SMS, and it's now a smartphone, but back in the days it was about using SMS to kind of create social network in a world where there wasn't necessarily the internet or smartphone in that way, and that's using design thinking in that kind of way. It's about understanding the way that we can deliver renewable energy to parts of the world that don't have electricity, and design is often the solution that delivers in that way. On a kind of more kind of graphic and branding front, it's about hopefully allowing people that want to get their message out in the world have the tools that are easily available for anybody to be able to communicate. In the long run, I believe, and this is me being optimistic, that design will be a great democratizer that allows anyone to have their kind of their ability to be able to open a platform and use it for it. You can even argue that the people you see in the streets of America right now who are protesting one side or another are using design in the way that they're capturing the things that they believe on the cardboard signs or the signs that they're holding up or what they're putting on their own social media. So I think in a way it's become a very valuable tool in our social discourse, and it will just continue to grow on that front, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I didn't ask you at the beginning, and I don't think I've ever asked you this. Why did you get into the design space?
I got into design slightly by accident. So I was really into art as a kid, but I also knew I probably didn't want to be an artist. And what I didn't realize when I was younger, but I kind of dawned on me one day, was that actually what I was really into was curiosity about the world. I've always been fascinated by stuff. I'm fascinated by music, art, books, things that people are doing, technology, etc. And ultimately, design is the confluence of all those things. And so for me, it was talking to some.
Curiosity got you in there.
What's that?
Curiosity.
Yeah, curiosity is literally that. I'm just fascinated by stuff and what people do and why things look the way they look and why things work the way they work. And I'm a bit of a nosy person, and design is a good way of you being at the intersection of all those things, because ultimately what you're doing is you're hopefully driving culture, you're driving commerce, you're making connections with people, and so therefore that curiosity is at the beginning of all that.
So what killed the cat got you into your career? Yeah. We have a question here from a Vic D. Thanks for your question, Vic D. You mentioned customer journey, and Vic D asks, as a UX designer, I found it extremely difficult to convince leadership to elevate the value it brings to a business. Could you share your thoughts on overcoming this challenge? How do you get the bosses to listen?
How do you get the bosses to listen to UX particularly? Well, it's very difficult. I think UX is a complex subject because there's kind of a few kind of things at play there. Number one, it's one of those things that a lot of people think they can do, but they necessarily can't, because we've all got a relationship with user experience in our everyday, and there's an element of it which is logical, and so therefore logic is something that most people hold. I think for me, the challenges I've had in convincing people to purchase design skills or UX or get people to invest in stuff previously is to benchmark against other companies where they've seen success. And so a good example of that is for many years, Dropbox and Box. Box was a company that had a superior technological product, but didn't really believe in the marketing of it, particularly didn't really believe in talking about it in a kind of like enlightened and interesting way, because they thought that the product was enough. Whereas Dropbox is a company that supposedly had and I'm not one to judge the technical components of it, the engineering, an inferior product, but had a higher share price for a long time, had a greater market share, because they understood that they had to take people on the journey about their product. They had to convince them why cloud-based storage, before cloud-based storage was a thing, was a good way of doing it. Had to get over the skepticism of keeping our things in the cloud. We had to explain what the cloud is. Beyond that, they also innovated around into other pieces of software such as paper, etc. And so within that,
but Vic's point, it sounds like Vic's, in your analogy, at Box rather than Dropbox.
Yeah,
if you're at Box, how do you? You can't.
You say Dropbox are doing better than us. Here's all the reasons why they've done it, and show the ROI that you'll get by delivering good UX. So I think if you ever got trouble convincing powers of B to spend it, you have to go out and find good demonstrative examples of how other people have done it, the value that they've got it, and be able to stand up for your beliefs on that front.
Okay, thank you for that. Derek Branch asked a question. Thank you, Derek. With the new normal that we're in, how do you continue to give a personal connection with your consumer base using mostly digital interactions?
So that's Duncan and I was kind of talking about this a little bit at the beginning before a lot of people joined. But for me, it's about over communicating. I think you have to say more than you normally would. You have to use different platforms. Sometimes it's video, sometimes it's text. You have to get a bit more informal with people sometimes. I've got a lot more people on my WhatsApp than I had in a work environment previously, because sometimes you just need to reach out to people and ping them, and obviously making sure that they're all right with that level of connection. But for me, I think it's about really thinking about what's going on in their minds, where they are with that. And then in terms of my own team, I've been just checking in with them way more than I normally would, because I can't see them. I'm not seeing their kind of body language or the way that they are dealing with the challenging times that we're living in.
Okay, well, that's covered, I think, pretty much everything that we discussed before. Thanks for the questions. If there's any more questions, please drop them in right now, as we're coming towards the end of our allotted time, and I know that someone else will be wanting to come on the stage, so I don't want to run over.
I'm going to answer Alex's questions, which is in the chat that's come out there. Is it important to copyright or trademark your brand before getting started, or can you wait until after rolling out the product or service? Trademark's a really complicated thing. I would always advise trademarking as soon as you possibly can, though understand that it is a cost that a company needs to take into account. I think within that, if you cover your assets, as long as you really believe in them, sooner rather than later, then you know that you're covered and it's not going to come back to bite you. There's plenty of people that have said, I'll trademark it when we get bigger, and have never come back to it, and then have got themselves in a situation where they've got to change a company name or a company logo or some other aspect of their brand. And in doing that, it's causing them a headache later in the day. There's online services like Trademark Now that you can use, which will help you check your trademarks and see where you are.
So I've got to ask Avani Petwadan's question here, which I'm sure we're not going to agree on, although I can see both sides to it. Where did it go? What plays a greater impact, great design or great marketing?
Ideally, the two in hand, because you need one to be able to do the other. So you have to have great design to be able to create great marketing, and a marketing idea is not enough. The argument you could make is actually you need a great product or services first, otherwise you're just designing and marketing around something that's never going to be successful.
Yeah, but as you said earlier, and as we both know, and I've spent more time in my career doing this than I haven't, is creating a perceptual brand difference between products that are either nearly identical or identical.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the truism of the difference between a great product and a great brand. Coca-Cola, 2/3 of people prefer it branded. Unbranded, 2/3 of people prefer Pepsi. It's the most perfect example of a product versus a brand. And yet Pepsi have never communicated that sufficiently well. You actually prefer this.
Yeah, they tried, but they never managed to get there. But it's also because Coca-Cola understood that they needed their icons. They've had some really brilliant advertising, which is, 80% of most public populations remember things visually rather than verbally. So it's no good telling them, you have to show them. And in showing people things, you have to put things that stick in their mind. You have to use evocative emotions. The ability for Coca-Cola to run the same holidays advert every year with the truck.
You see that logo thing, right, where it goes Coca-Cola 18 to now, and Pepsi's got.
Pepsi changing all over the place. So
how is it, or was it, that Coca-Cola managed to get it so wrong with Coca-Cola Classic?
They tried. People don't like change. They tried too much change too quickly, and didn't take people on the journey with them.
Right.
And I think you have to. It's the communication challenge again. They didn't communicate why they were doing it. They just communicated what they were doing. And if they communicated why, they probably would have got away with it, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Same way when Gap changed their logo. If they'd done better communication around it, it would be the Gap logo now, but they got cold feet and dropped back.
Right. And from what you told me, Airbnb went through a similar wobble, didn't they? No,
not really. It was just there was a lot of emphasis around the Airbnb logo when it launched, but there wasn't a wobble.
Oh, okay. All right. I think we're gonna wrap it up here. So there's time for the next session. Thank you, James, for taking time. I know you're a very, very busy man with many clients, including me, on your tail wanting stuff. Really, really appreciate it. And for anyone who hasn't looked at Koto, I thoroughly recommend a little rummage around their website. Some really inspiring stuff there. And if you ever need any design resource, obviously go to Fiverr, and then you can also look at Koto.
Hire us on Fiverr. That's the thing to do.
Find us on Find Koto on Fiverr. More of that coming.
Okay.
Okay. What do we do now? Leave. Cheerio, James. I'll be speaking to you anon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.